Hello, I'm Keith Hockton, author, historian, and host of Rearview Mirror Chronicles, where we take a look back at the people and the moments that shaped our world through history. Hello. Today I want to tell you what might be the greatest story ever told. A tale so powerful it has survived almost 3,000 years. It was being recited around fires before anyone in Greece could even write it down. And it's still shaping the films that you watch and the novels that you read today. Of course, I'm talking about Homer's Odyssey. Every time you've watched Indiana Jones, Star Wars, The Lord of the Rings, even Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, Gladiator, or any film about an impossible journey home, you've been watching echoes of the Odyssey. Now, before you switch off, imagining a dusty classroom and a droning teacher, give me a few minutes, because the Odyssey isn't what you think it is. It's a monster story, yes. An adventure story, absolutely. But at its heart, it's something much simpler and more human. It's the story of a man who just wants to go home, and of everything the universe throws at him to stop that from happening. And I think there are three really great questions worth answering. What happens? Why did it survive? And what does it mean? By the end, I promise you'll understand not just the plot, but why this ancient poem still has its hooks in us. Let's set sail. The Odyssey is one of the oldest surviving works of literature in the Western world. It's older than the Roman Empire, older than classical Athens, older than democracy itself. We don't even know whether Homer was one man, several poets, or simply the name given to centuries of oral storytelling. And look, it's probably older than it looks, because whoever Homer was, he was drawing on oral traditions passed down for hundreds of years before him. When you hear the Odyssey, you're actually hearing echoes of a world that may have existed 3,500 years ago. So the poem actually follows Odysseus, king of Ithaca, a small rocky island off the western coast of Greece. And, of course, his struggle to get home after the Trojan War, a journey that should have actually taken weeks and instead took 10 years. The poem runs to about 12,000 lines across 24 books. And crucially, I think, it was never meant to be read silently in an armchair. It was performed, sung aloud by professional bards over several evenings, with music. It was the box set, if you like, of the ancient world, and that shapes the way the whole story is built. To understand why Odysseus is sailing home, you actually need to know the war he's sailing home from. So for 10 long years, the Greeks and the Trojans fought outside the walls of Troy, a war told in another epic attributed to Homer called the Iliad. One quick myth to clear up, though. The Iliad is not the story of the Trojan horse. It actually ends before Troy falls. The wooden horse comes from later traditions and actually gets retold inside the Odyssey itself. So if you've ever confidently placed that horse in the Iliad, well, you're in good company. So how did this war start? Well, with the most famous beauty contest in mythology. Three goddesses, Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite, each wanted to be declared the fairest, and they handed that impossible job of judging to a prince of Troy named Paris. And put yourself in his sandals for a moment. Three of the most powerful beings in the universe are standing in front of you, and you have to tell two of them that they've lost the beauty contest. There is no good outcome here. Each goddess then offers him a bribe, and Aphrodite made one that he couldn't refuse. The most beautiful woman in the world. So Paris chose her. But his prize, Helen, was already married to Menelaus, king of Sparta. Paris took Helen back to Troy, and the kings of Greece banded together to get her back. 1,000 ships, as the phrase goes. And 10 years of siege and slaughter beneath the walls of Troy. Among the kings who sailed, was a man from a very small island who never wanted to go in the first place, and his name was Odysseus. So let me start by telling you what Odysseus wasn't, because that actually matters. He wasn't the strongest of the Greeks. That was Ajax. He wasn't the bravest or the deadliest. That was Achilles, the closest thing the ancient world had to a superhero. Physical gifts were never what set Odysseus apart. His greatest weapon was actually his mind. And the Greeks have a word for the quality that defined him: metis, cunning intelligence, resourcefulness, the ability to read a situation and see the trick nobody else sees. If Achilles solves problems by hitting them harder, Odysseus solves them by outthinking them. He's the man who dreamed up the Trojan horse, the trick that ended a 10-year war when brute force had failed. And here's the key to the whole poem. Everything flows from that one quality. Every escape in disguise comes from Metis. And some of his worst disasters come when his cleverness gets overtaken by his pride. Keep that tension in mind, because it's the actual engine of this story. The mind that can outwit a monster attached to a heart that can't resist shouting its own name. And here's where Homer does something storytellers have copied ever since. The poem doesn't begin at the beginning. It starts almost at the end. When it opens, Odysseus has been away 20 years, 10 fighting at Troy, 10 trying and failing to get home. Every other surviving Greek hero made it back long ago. Odysseus alone has vanished, and everyone assumes he's dead. Meanwhile, his palace on Ithaca has been invaded, not by an army, but by suitors. More than 100 arrogant noblemen have moved in, eating his food, drinking his wine, each wanting to marry his wife, Penelope, and seize his kingdom. She refuses to choose. They refuse to leave. Modern screenwriters actually call this starting in media res, in the middle of things, and they all learned it directly or indirectly from Homer. Because of this structure, the poem actually weaves 3 parallel stories. The first belongs to Telemachus, Odysseus' son, a baby when his father sailed, now a young man of 20 who has never known him, prompted by the goddess Athena to leave Ithaca and search for news. The second is Odysseus' own adventures across the Mediterranean, mostly told as flashbacks, with Odysseus himself narrating them at a feast, the greatest trickster in Greek literature, given the bard's role. The third act belongs to Penelope, and let me be clear, she's not a passive character waiting by the window. She holds off 100 powerful men alone for years, using nothing but her wits. She's every bit her husband's equal. So father, son, and mother, 3 threads pulling towards each other until they finally meet in one of the most satisfying endings, I think, in literature. But first we need the adventures. So let's rewind 10 years to the moment the Trojan War ends and Odysseus sets sail with 12 ships. Here's what happened to them. The first stop isn't a monster story at all. Fresh from Troy, Odysseus and his men raid a city of the Cicones. And after they've won, they linger on the beach feasting instead of leaving. The survivors return with reinforcements and cut dozens of Greeks down at dawn. The lesson lands hard and early. Victory breeds carelessness. These men survived 10 years of war, and it takes less than a week of peace for them to start dying. The next stop is quieter and stranger. A storm blows them to the land of the Lotus Eaters, a very gentle people who simply offer their visitors the fruit of the lotus. A few of the crew eat it, and they forget. They lose all desire to go home. Odysseus has to drag them back to the ships in tears. So nearly 3,000 years ago, Homer gave us one of literature's earliest portraits of escapism, the sweet oblivion that actually asks nothing of you and quietly takes everything. And the enemy of the journey home isn't always a monster with teeth. Sometimes it's just pure comfort. And now we come to it. Odysseus and a scouting party land on a rugged island, and they find an enormous cave stocked with delicious cheeses and ripe lambs. And his men want to grab what they can and run. Odysseus, always curious, insists on staying to meet the owner, and it's a decision he'll regret for the rest of his life. The owner is Polyphemus, a Cyclops, a one-eyed giant the size of a hill. He enters the cave and then rolls a boulder across the entrance that no team of men could ever move. And when he notices his visitors, he doesn't offer them dinner. He makes them dinner, snatching up 2 of the men and eating them, and then eating another 2 the following morning. And here's where the story becomes a masterclass. Odysseus can't simply kill the sleeping giant because if Polyphemus dies, nobody can move the boulder. Brute force is literally useless. Only a clever mind can solve this. So Odysseus offers the giant strong wine, and when Polyphemus, delighted, asks his name, Odysseus gives him one of the greatest answers in all of storytelling. My name is Nobody. The giant then passes out drunk, and Odysseus and his men drive a sharpened, fire-hardened stake into his single eye. Polyphemus wakes screaming, and the other Cyclops on the island come running. What's wrong? Is someone attacking you? They shout. And he roars back the only answer he has. Nobody is attacking me. So they shrug and walk away. Because if nobody's attacking you, they say, you must be sick. You know, I've read that scene a dozen times, and it still makes me smile. It's a pun that saves 6 lives, like the oldest and the best, who's on first, what's on second, that routine back in history. Then comes the second half of the plan. In the morning, the blind giant rolls back the stone, but runs his hand over each sheep's back, feeling for escaping men. So Odysseus ties his men beneath the bellies of the rams, and the blind giant lovingly pats the very animals carrying his enemies to freedom. It's one of history's great examples of intelligence defeating brute strength. And if you remember only one scene from the Odyssey, it'll be this one. And it actually deserves to be. But of course, that story isn't over. And what happens next, for my money, is the most important moment within the poem. Odysseus and his men reach the ship and they pull away. They've escaped. All he has to do is sail off in silence. But he can't do that. So standing on the deck, he taunts the blinded giant and then does the fatal thing. He shouts him his real name. If anyone asks who blinded you, he calls, tell them it was Odysseus of Ithaca. It's the ancient equivalent of committing the perfect crime and then signing your name at the scene. And the price is actually beyond anything he could imagine because Polyphemus is actually the son of Poseidon, the god of the sea. The blinded giant then prays to his father, let Odysseus never reach home, or if he must, let him come late and broken and alone to find his house full of trouble. And of course, every word comes true. The god of the very sea Odysseus must cross spends the rest of the epic trying to destroy him. 10 years of wandering flow from this one moment of boasting. The same man whose cleverness conquered the Cyclops throws it all away because he needs the monster to know his name. That's not a monster problem. That's a human one. And it's why this poem is really about us. So what happens next might be the cruelest scene of the story. Odysseus reaches the island of Aeolus, keeper of the winds, who actually gives him an extraordinary parting gift, a great leather bag holding every wind that blows, all sealed inside. Every wind except the gentle one that will actually carry him straight home. He allows him to use that one straight away. So for 9 days, that steady wind pushes the ships towards Ithaca, and Odysseus holds the sail rope himself the entire time, refusing to sleep. On the 10th day, they come so close to Ithaca, they can actually see men tending fires on the shore. And then, exhausted, beyond endurance, he finally falls asleep. His sailors had been eyeing that mysterious bag for the whole voyage, convinced it's treasure their captain is hoarding. So, with insight of home, they open it. Every wind on Earth explodes out at once and hurls the entire fleet back across the sea, all the way to where they started. And look, I find this episode almost unbearable, and I think Homer means us to find it that way. Notice what destroyed them this time. It's not a monster, it's not an angry god, but human greed and suspicion. The gods handed Odysseus his homecoming in a bag, and human nature tore it open within sight of the shore. Odysseus still has 12 ships at this point. In the next episode, that changes forever. The fleet enters a beautiful harbor ringed by cliffs, but Odysseus, with the instinct that keeps saving his life, moors his own ship outside the harbor mouth. The land belongs to the Lestrygonians, who turn out to be cannibal giants. They swarm the cliff tops and hurl boulders down onto the trapped ships below, and 11 ships are smashed and sunk. Only Odysseus's escapes. Homer doesn't linger, and somewhere that makes it worse. From this point on, there is no fleet, just one ship, one crew, and a captain carrying the weight of it all. That single ship reaches Aea, home of Circe, an enchantress who lives in a stone house in the woods, surrounded by strangely tame lions and wolves. The animals, as it turns out, aren't pets. Odysseus then sends half his crew to investigate. Circe feasts them, touches them with her wand, and turns them all into pigs. Pigs with the minds of men, weeping in their pens. One man escapes to bring the news. Odysseus then sets off alone, and on the way, the god Hermes gives him a magical herb, Molly, that makes him immune to her spells. When Circe's magic fails, the astonished goddess yields and restores his men. Then the story turns. Circe becomes one of Odysseus's greatest allies. The crew stays a full year, feasting and recovering, until his own men have to remind him that it's time to go. A quiet echo of the lotus. Even rest can become a trap. When they leave, Circe gives them guidance they'll need, but her first instruction is actually terrifying. Before you can sail home, you must go down to the land of the dead. This is where the Odyssey becomes more than just an adventure story. Odysseus sails to the edge of the world and summons the spirits of the dead. He meets the prophet he came to consult, who tells him the road home. But it's the other meetings that actually break your heart. He meets his own mother, and this is how he learns for the first time that she died of grief, waiting for a son who never came home. 3 times he tries to embrace her, and 3 times his arms close on empty air. He then meets Agamemnon, the great king murdered on his first night home by his own wife and her lover. A dark mirror and a warning. Don't assume home is safe just because it's home. And then he meets Achilles, the greatest warrior of his age, the man who chose a short, glorious life over a long, obscure one. Odysseus greets him with honor, sure that he must rule as a king among the dead, and Achilles gives him one of the most famous replies in literature. Don't try to comfort me about death. I would rather be a poor laborer alive under the sun than a king over all the perished dead. What an amazing thing coming from the hero of the Iliad, who traded his life for glory, saying from the far side of death that he got the bargain wrong. In a single speech, Homer actually overturns the value system of his entire culture. And it speaks straight to Odysseus, the hero who keeps choosing life and home over every glittering alternative. And of course, the dead have just told him that he's absolutely right. The Sirens are creatures whose singing is so beautiful no man can resist it. Sailors turn their ships towards the sound and they get wrecked on the rocks. And the Sirens' meadow is actually heaped with bones. The standard defense is simple. Plug your ears with wax and row past. But Odysseus, perfectly in character, doesn't just want to survive them. He wants to hear them and live. So his crew plug their ears, but he has them tie him to the mast, hands and feet, with orders that no matter how he begs, they mustn't release him. If anything, just tie the ropes tighter. And you know what? It actually works exactly as designed. The sirens sing, and cleverly they sing not about beauty, but about knowledge. Come to us, and we'll tell you everything that happens on this earth. They offer the one thing a man like Odysseus can't resist, and he breaks, screaming to the crew to be released. The crew, hearing nothing, row on, and they tie him tighter. He heard the song and survived, the only man who ever did both. And the lesson, I think, is one of my favorites. Knowledge without self-control is dangerous. Odysseus succeeds because he knows himself. He knows his willpower will fail, so he builds a system that doesn't depend on it. He makes the decision while he's strong that will protect him when he's weak. You know, honestly, it might be the most beautiful practical piece of wisdom in the whole epic. And people have applied it to everything from addiction to investing ever since. The next trial gives us a phrase that we still use. The ship actually must pass a narrow strait with no way around. On one side is Scylla, a six-headed monster who snatches men off the deck. On the other is Charybdis, a giant whirlpool that swallows the whole sea and everything on it. Circe's advice was blunt. You cannot win this one. Hug Scylla's cliff and lose 6 men, because 6 dead is better than everyone dead. And that's exactly what happens. The 6 heads strike, and 6 men are plucked, screaming into the air, while Odysseus can do nothing but keep rowing. And this is actually where we get the expression between a rock and a hard place. And I think it captures something true and hard about leadership that most adventure stories never really touch on. Sometimes there's no clever tricks. Sometimes every option is bad. And leading means choosing which price to pay and living with it. Even Metis has limits. And Homer is honest enough, I think, to show us where they are. And let's just take a quick break, and we'll be back in a second with part 2. Autodomous is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa. But they are much, much more than that. When you sign up with Autodomous, you become part of a larger community. A community that actually cares about you and your family in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. For more information, go talk to TG or WhatsApp him on +60 12 49 37 270 or visit their website penangmyhome.com. And we're back. Then comes the disaster prophesied from the start. The crew lands on Thrinacia, where the sun god Helios keeps his sacred castle, with one clear warning: do not eat them. At first, all is well, but the winds turn and they pin the ship for a month. The food runs out, and while Odysseus is away praying, his starving men crack. They slaughter the cattle and they roast them on the beach. The omens are immediate. Helios demands justice, and when the ship sails, Zeus splits it with a thunderbolt. Every member of the crew drowns. Only Odysseus survives, clinging to the wreckage, swept alone across the sea. Of the 12 ships and the hundreds of men who left Troy, 1 man now remains. And notice again what destroyed them. Not a monster, but a broken promise. Their own appetite in a moment of weakness against a warning they'd known all along. The sea carries the lone survivor to Ogygia, home of the goddess Calypso. And here the story stops for 7 years. Calypso is beautiful, immortal, and lonely, and she falls in love with her castaway. Her island is a genuine paradise, and she offers him the ultimate prize. Stay with me, and I'll make you immortal. You'll never age, you'll never die, you'll live forever in paradise with me. It's everything every Greek hero and myth ever grasped at, offered freely. All he has to do is stop wanting to go home. And of course he refuses. Homer gives us the image that, for me, actually defines the whole poem. Every day Odysseus leaves Calypso's comfortable cave and sits alone on the shore, staring across the empty sea towards an island that he cannot reach, weeping. When the gods finally order her to release him, she makes one last appeal. Remember, she's a goddess, and Penelope, Odysseus' wife, is a mortal woman who's aging. How can he prefer that? And his answer is gentle and devastating at the same time. Everything you say is true, he tells her, and even so, all I want every day of my life is to go home. He chooses a mortal wife, an ordinary island, and a death that is certainly coming over eternity in paradise. It's Achilles' lessons from the underworld, lived out in a single choice. A real, limited human life with the people you love is worth more than an endless, perfect one without them. And 3,000 years later, I'm pretty sure no one has said it better. And I think it's also worth pausing on Calypso because the way we've remembered her says as much about us as it does about Homer. For a long time, she's been cast as the seductress, the temptress who lures a married man into her bed and keeps him there. But that isn't quite what the Greek says. Calypso holds Odysseus prisoner. He sits on that shore weeping precisely because he can't leave. The goddess has the power and he doesn't. He isn't a straying husband, he's a captive. And yet, translation after translation, century after century, softened that into a love affair. The great hero, if you like, dallying with a nymph. Because a man held helpless by a woman didn't fit the picture of what a hero or a woman was supposed to be. It actually took until 2017 for that to be seriously disturbed, when Emily Wilson published the first English translation. Part of what she did was almost embarrassingly simple. She went back to the Greek and refused the loaded language earlier translators had smuggled in, where generations of scholars had actually called the enslaved girls of Ithaca sluts and whores, girls who had no power to refuse anyone. Wilson actually called them what the text actually says they are, slaves. The words on the page are nearly 3,000 years old. What actually changed was us and what we were prepared to see. So, at long last, shipwrecked once more, then carried home by friendly strangers, Odysseus sets foot on Ithaca after 20 years. Of course, you'd expect trumpets. Instead, the last third of the poem becomes a slow-burning thriller. He can't just walk in the front door because there's more than 100 armed suitors who'd kill him on sight. And the memory of Agamemnon murdered on his own doorstep is burning in his mind. So Athena disguises him, withers his skin, dims his eyes, dresses him in rags. The great king returns to his own kingdom as an old beggar, mocked in his own halls, quietly marking who stayed faithful and who betrayed him. Nobody recognizes him, except one. Lying on a dung heap by the gates is an old, dying dog named Argos. 20 years ago, Odysseus raised him as a puppy, then sailed for Troy. Argos has waited ever since, and when the disguised beggar walks through the gate, past a disguise that fools every human being, the old dog knows it's him instantly. But he hasn't the strength to stand. He can only prop his ears and wag his tail as the master passes. And Odysseus sees him, but he can't go to him, because a beggar greeting the king's dog would betray everything. He turns his face away, wipes a tear, and walks on. And Argos, having finally seen his master come home, closes his eyes and dies. 3,000 years, and that scene still lands a punch, built from the simplest materials imaginable: an old dog, a returning master, and 20 years of faithfulness that asked for nothing in return. So while all this unfolds, what about Penelope? I said she was her husband's equal in cunning, and here's the proof. For years, suitors have demanded that she choose one of them. She can't refuse outright. She's one woman surrounded by 100 very dangerous men. So she makes them a promise. Let me first finish weaving a burial shroud for Odysseus's old father, and when it's done, I'll choose. Reasonable, pious, respectable. The suitors agree and they settle in to wait. And every day, Penelope weaves at her great loom, and every night, by torchlight, she secretly unpicks the day's works thread by thread. Each morning, she starts again on a shroud that never grows, and she keeps this up for more than 3 years, holding off 100 men with wool and patience, before a servant finally betrays her secret. It's a defensive campaign, I think, fought without armies or allies, and it's waged with pure metis. Odysseus fights monsters. Penelope holds a kingdom with a loom. So never let anyone tell you she's the passive one in this marriage. And hold on to Penelope's shape for a moment, because it's about to matter far beyond this poem. Here is a woman who stays home and keeps the hearth while the story happens to the men. Faithful, patient, chaste, besieged by suitors she won't yield to, tending the fire and the household and the memory of an absent husband for 20 years. That figure, the good woman defined by her waiting and her purity, would become one of the most durable templates in all of Western storytelling. And culture would actually return to her again and again. But notice what Homer actually gives her, and what the later versions so often mislaid. His Penelope isn't only virtuous, she's the cleverest person in the poem, a strategist running a 3-year campaign of misdirection against 100 armed men, matching her husband trick for trick. The tradition that inherited her tended to keep the patience and the chastity and quietly file away the cunning until faithful wife came to mean passive wife. And that's not Homer's original Penelope. That's what a few thousand years of retelling the story by men did to her. So now the threads pull together. Penelope announces a contest. She brings out the great bow of Odysseus, a weapon only he could ever string, and declares she'll marry whichever suitor can string it and shoot an arrow through the sockets of 12 axe heads in a row. And one by one, the strongest suitors try. They strain and they sweat, and they warm the bow by the fire, and not even one can bend it far enough to loop the string. The bow actually defeats them all. And then the old beggar, sitting quietly on the edge of the hall, asks if he might try. The suitors erupt in outrage, a filthy tramp handling the king's bow. But Telemachus, who by now knows exactly who the beggar is, insists. Then the hall falls silent as the old man turns the bow over in his hands, checking it the way a bard checks a familiar lyre, and strings it effortlessly. I love it. He actually plucks it once, and it sings like a swallow. Overhead, Zeus rolls a pearl of thunder. Odysseus sets an arrow on the string and sends it clean through all 12 axes. It's Odysseus. The disguise falls away, and every door of the hall has already been quietly locked. What follows is one of the bloodiest endings in literature, and Homer doesn't flinch. Odysseus turns the bow on the suitors, the men who invaded his home, devoured his wealth, harassed his wife, and effectively plotted to murder his son. The odds actually sound impossible. More than 100 suitors against Odysseus, young Telemachus, and 2 loyal herdsmen. But the suitors are trapped in a locked hall, their weapons quietly removed in advance, and the man with the bow has Athena at his shoulder and 20 years of fury in his hands. Father and son fight side by side for the first time in their lives, and when it's over, every suitor is dead. Modern readers often find this shocking, and it kind of is, but it's worth understanding how the poem sees it. The suitors haven't just been rude house guests. They've violated Xena, the sacred law of hospitality protected by Zeus himself, grinding away at a household for years and, of course, plotting murder. Within the poem's moral universe, this isn't a massacre. It's justice arriving a little bit late, but all at once. the restoration of a family, a kingship, and a divine order. Whether we agree is one of the questions the poem leaves us to argue about, and people have argued about it for millennia. So you might think that the story ends there, but Homer has one more scene, and it might be the best, I think, in the entire poem. Penelope is told the beggar was Odysseus, and that her husband is home and the suitors are dead. And she doesn't believe it. 20 years of hope and disappointment have taught her caution. This woman didn't survive 100 suitors by being easy to convince. What if it's a trick, or a god in disguise, or an imposter? So she tests him, a trap worthy of Odysseus himself. She calmly turns to a servant and orders the great bed moved out of the chamber and made up for a stranger. And Odysseus, the unshakable, the master of disguise, the man who kept his composure in a monster's cave, explodes. Impossible, he says. No one can move that bed. I built it myself around the trunk of a living olive tree rooted in the earth. The tree is one bedpost. The whole room was actually raised around it. And that's the secret only the real Odysseus could know. The secret of their marriage bed, shared by two people alone in all the world. You know, Penelope's knees actually give way. She runs to him and finally accepts him, clinging to him, Homer says, the way a shipwrecked sailor clings to the shore. And notice what that final image hides in plain sight. A marriage literally rooted in the earth, unmovable, alive, and still growing. So just a quick word about the gods who have been meddling in every scene. Athena, goddess of wisdom, is Odysseus's tireless companion. She loves him because he thinks the way she does. Poseidon hates him for blinding his son and spends a decade making him pay. Zeus sits above the fray, keeping the balance. But here's what surprises modern readers. These gods aren't remote or holy. They're jealous, they're proud, they're competitive, they're nursing grudges for years. Olympus actually runs on office politics. And that's part of the genius because it makes for a world where being good isn't enough. You also have to be smart. And even then, you just might be unlucky. So why has this survived and what does it mean? The Odyssey, I think, is built from themes you've met 1,000 times since. There's nostos, homecoming, the ache for home that drives the whole poem and gives us the word nostalgia. There's identity and disguise. A hero calls himself nobody and must painfully become somebody again, earning back his name one recognition at a time. There's intelligence over strength. There's xenia, hospitality, by which the poem judges everyone we meet. There's loyalty in Penelope's loom and an old dog on a dung heap. There's pride and its price. One boast, 10 years of suffering. The word Odyssey itself has become part of the language. Any long eventful journey and Odysseus' name, a byword for cleverness rather than strength, which I think tells you which of his qualities the world actually chooses to remember. Virgil answered it with Aeneid. Dante walked his own underworld with Homer beside him. James Joyce built Ulysses directly on its skeleton. And every Castaway film and road movie since is sailing in its wake. You know, when a story structure works for 3,000 years straight, that's not formulaic. That's something true about us. And here's the inheritance I think I find most striking of all, the one that sent me down this whole line of thinking in the first place. Once you see the Odyssey as the template for the hero's journey, the reluctant hero called away from home, the mentor at his shoulder, the trials and the monsters, the descent into the land of the dead, and the long road back to a self remade, you start to notice how many later heroes are moving to the same rhythm. And the single most influential hero story in the history of the West arrived about 1,000 years after Homer in a very different kind of book. Look at the shape of the Gospels with the Odyssey fresh in your mind, and the echoes are hard to unhear. Another hero who goes out under a father's law, where Odysseus lives and dies by the laws of Zeus, the divine order of justice and hospitality, the whole poem is measured against. The Gospels actually give us a son sent under the law of God and the Father. Another hero tested in the wilderness rather than at sea. Another descent among the dead. The older creeds have Christ harrow hell between the cross and the empty tomb, just as Odysseus sails to the edge of the world to speak with the shades, and another homecoming and another return transformed. Look, I'm not claiming the evangelists sat down with a copy of Homer. I'm saying that both stories are drinking from the same deep well of what a hero's journey is, and the Odyssey got there first and dug it deepest. But it's actually the women around these two heroes where the parallels really caught me, and where the same distorting hand shows up in both. Set Penelope beside Mary the mother, the faithful woman who keeps the home and holds herself pure, while the story happens to the men, ringed by suitors or kept apart from them, defined either way by her chastity. And set Calypso beside Mary Magdalene, the woman remembered as the seductress, the dangerous one, the fallen one. In both cases, the label turns out to be a lie the tradition told about its own text. Calypso, as we've seen, is a captor. She's not a temptress. And Mary Magdalene, on the evidence of the Gospels themselves, was never a prostitute at all. That image, Magdalene the reformed harlot, actually comes from a single sermon preached by Pope Gregory the Great in the year 591, in which he quietly fused three separate women from the Gospels into one composite sinner. It actually stuck for 1400 years until the church itself set it aside in 1969. Strip the invention away, and what's left is astonishing. Not the sinner of the story, but the first witness to the resurrection, the one Jesus sends to carry the news to the men who had scattered. The early church had a title for her the later centuries somehow conveniently forgot. The apostle to the apostles. She was never the fallen woman at his feet. She was the one who guided the others to the most important moment in the entire book. So here's the thread that ties all of this together, I think. The thing I genuinely can't stop turning over. These stories reached us through translators, and translators are people working inside the assumptions of their own age. The Odyssey most of us grew up with was filtered through Victorian gentlemen who knew exactly what a virtuous woman was and what a fallen one was, and who rendered the Greek accordingly, until Wilson went back and simply declined to call enslaved girls whores. The very same kind of hand that shaped how the women of the Bible came down to us. The hero in both traditions we keep intact. Father's law we kept, but the women got sorted into a much smaller set of boxes. The virgin and the temptress, the one who waits and the one who leads a man astray. An enormous amount of that sorting happened not in the original text, but in the retelling by translators and preachers reaching for the categories that their own century had handed them. Two of the foundational stories of the Western imagination, if you like, and running quietly through both of them, the same edit, made again and again by the same kind of hand, until only in our own lifetimes someone finally went back to the source and read what was actually there. And the person who did that was a woman. So let me leave you with this. What makes the Odyssey timeless is that it was never really about defeating monsters. Look back across the entire story. The Cyclops didn't ruin Odysseus. His own boasting did. The bag of winds didn't fail. His crew's greed opened it. The sun god's cattle didn't leap onto the fire. Hunger and weakness put them there. Again and again, his greatest enemies are human ones. His pride, his impatience, and the mistakes of the flawed, frightened people around him. The monsters are unforgettable for sure, but they were never the real danger. The message I think that Homer sends us is that we are. So after 20 years of war, wandering, temptation, and loss, after a goddess offered him eternity and he sat on the beach and wept for home instead, his deepest desire was never glory or immortality. It was to walk back through his own door to his wife, his son, an old dog at the gate, and a bed built around a living tree. That's why this poem still resonates to me after nearly 3,000 years. Beneath the gods and the monsters lie a profoundly human story about endurance, about holding on to who you are when the whole world tries to make you forget, and about the stubborn, unlikable belief that no matter how long the journey, home is actually worth fighting for. This episode of Rearview Mirror Chronicles is brought to you by Entrepot Publishing, the home of independent storytelling. We publish books that celebrate history, art, and the extraordinary people who make life fascinating. You can find our titles and maybe your next great read at entrepotpublishing.com. Thanks for listening in, folks. Bye for now.